Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another exciting virtual experience here with the Waterways Report and myself, Chris Stodinger with Pretty Gritty Tours. We are looking at a fascinating topic tonight. It is the involvement of hydrofoils and hydroplanes and surface effect ships in Puget Sound, and specifically Tacoma is really where we're focused tonight. But the greater Puget Sound region has had a tremendous involvement in the evolvement of hydroplanes and surface effect ships. And so I would like to introduce you to that tonight because it's a fascinating topic and one that I hope you'll be really passionate about by the time we're done here. And it's amazing, I think, when you look at the whole history of it developing kind of out here. And this is to say that the hydroplane, the hydrofoil, was invented in Tacoma, but there has been a huge involvement in the development and pioneering of that technology here. And I hope to prove that by the end of it. But it's something that, at least in my research, I've come across a definitive book that is, how did we get here from there? So, sounds like we might be having a hard time with the audio tonight. Let me see if I can fix that, and then you guys let me know if it's sounding any better here in a second. How's it sounding now? Oh no, not the video. Hold on. Let's see if we can fix this. Good to see you guys all. I'm glad you're all here. We're gonna so we can counter our technical difficulties really quick, and then go from there. Oh man! All right, hold on. We can fix this. I'm very confident. I think after all these years, right? Okay, how's it sound now? Let me know if it's coming through any better. And then we can dive in from there. What has it been? How many years of virtual tours now? How many years of video production? You'd think, okay, there it is. We're back. I'm trying to stutter less today. So welcome to the exciting world of hydroplanes and hydrofoils and Tacoma and Seattle's involvement in that great story. And it really focuses on this beauty right here. This is the SES 100A, or the Surface Effect Ship 100A. And this was pioneered back in the late 60s, early 70s in Tacoma. This was specifically made right down here in Commencement Bay, the Tacoma waterfront, and it was designed for the US Navy. This is what it looks like from the front here. But it follows a long legacy of high-powered, hydroplanes, essentially these craft that were designed to go so incredibly fast that they create lift using water instead of air and then plane across the water. And before anybody comes at me in the comments, I am not a scientist. I have done my best investigative research on this one, but if I get any of the science wrong on surface effect ships, feel free to let me know, but you don't have to be mad about it. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my best tonight. So this was the surface effect ship designed for the US Navy here in Tacoma. But how did we get here? I'm going to float the theory, ship pun, that it begins really with our involvement during Prohibition era smuggling. And anybody who knows me knows that I have a deep fondness in my heart for this gentleman right here in the fedora. That is Johnny Schnarr. Johnny Schnarr is the most accomplished rum runner bootlegger from the 1920s in Puget Sound. And he operated really out of Canada, like Vancouver, Victoria, lived and operated in Puget Sound, and then delivered the vast majority of his illicit goods, his payload, down to both Tacoma and Seattle, but primarily Tacoma was his main enterprise. If you ever have the opportunity to read his book, Rum Runner, it's, Lord, what a journey that whole book is. But what it came down to is that Johnny was having a really difficult time evading the U.S. customs enforcers who were tasked out here to enforce the Volstead Act. And while they were hunting the waters looking for rum runners like him, they were getting increasingly swift ships. And these cutters that they were piloting, the US authorities, were suddenly reaching knots. I think it was like 18 knots, 14 to 18 knots was where they were. But they also had cannons, like guns, mounted on the front of their vessels, and bullets go even faster. So he was encountering a great deal of difficulty and danger smuggling illicit goods around. And so, as the story goes, Johnny decided that he was going to go down to Seattle one day and see if he could find a solution for his problem. And it just showed up in the form of World War I surplus airplane engines. Now, these mostly they were V-12 Victory engines, were surplus from World War I fighter planes, and were pretty common in Seattle at the time. Here's one of the planes. This picture was taken, obviously, in 1918 in France. Thank you, photographer, for labeling your stuff. And would have come equipped with something like this, one of these V-12 engines. Johnny had the idea of taking one of them and then retrofitting it into a boat like this one. Now, this is one of the vessels that we know Johnny Schnarr had. He had a fleet. His flagship, the one he was most proud of, was called Moonbeam. And I have never, through any archive or anywhere, ever found a picture of Moonbeam. But of course not. He was a criminal. No one was out there documenting this for posterity. It's just through the grace of goodness that we happen to have vessels like this one here. And this was actually up for sale recently. But this particular vessel, this is a little bit more about it here. This is the Kirinakwa, and I guarantee you I've pronounced that incorrectly. But this vessel was retrofitted with 2 V-12 engines. And Johnny got more sophisticated as time went on and went from just welding a wrench to the fly shaft so he could kickstart his boat to really developing the technology that allowed him to run one of these airplane engines efficiently on a marine boat. Now, they were water cooled, but there was a huge disadvantage to salt water getting any way mixed in this. Johnny also was responsible, I'm pretty confident, single-handedly for developing the technology to equalize the oil pressure in a lot of these, and then eventually coming up with a gearbox to retrofit something from an airplane into a boat. It went through a lot of trial and error, and while a lot of the inventions came from Johnny himself, it was workshopped with a whole variety of anonymous bootleggers and smugglers in Puget Sound who had a direct route from Canada into the greater Washington area via the sea. And this is something that wasn't as prevalent on the East Coast, or certainly in the Midwest, where a lot of the smuggling and the bootlegging came through with really fast cars driven through the nighttime with their headlights off. And so the same way that you see the dawn of NASCAR arrive from this bootlegging legacy, you also see things like Seafair show up in Washington State as a continuation of the jet boat airplane hydrofoil industry that was developing here in Washington. This is something that I just think is fascinating that you might care about too, maybe not. This is a cutwater. A cutwater is exactly what it sounds like. It is a piece of metal, usually stainless steel. In some cases, it was, like in Johnny Schnarr's case, it was iron, which obviously is terrible in salt water, but he was running fast and loose. And the cutwater's job was to make sure that when you are operating one of these vessels, that if you run into anything in the middle of the night, it cuts the water and then essentially stops you from just exploding upon hitting a log drifting in Puget Sound in the middle of the night. Because again, Johnny was running these boats under cover of darkness without light, attempting to be invisible. Now, here's the deal. When you drop a V-12 airplane engine in the back of a fishing boat, it suddenly allowed Johnny to achieve speeds of 34 knots. Pardon me. And that was revolutionary at the time. Nobody was even coming close to that. And I don't know if you caught it, but back in the picture of his other fishing boat, the one that we know was in his fleet, he also quickly learned that if he had a flat hull on his fishing boat, it would allow him to lift up out of the water and just crest along the top of the waves, thus allowing him to go even faster and to do so in heavy seas with large swells. So now we're seeing the dawn of this hydroplaning technology, which you can get two different hydroplanes out of this. One, because it has airplane engine, and also because it's hydroplaning along. At the end of Prohibition, Johnny has $10,000 in the bank and he just goes back to being a fisherman. But he sells not only his fleet of ultra fast boats, but a lot of the technology that went with them. And in his mind, this was now a useless vessel because it was too fast for any kind of pleasure boating. It wasn't reliable for a ferry. And even though he had successfully transported all of this, hundreds, thousands of cases of alcohol, he wasn't going to use it for passenger transportation because it would kick up all of this spray, rendering it essentially useless as a comfortable vessel. But salvaged from the graveyard of Johnny Shar's smuggling operation comes the era of the hydroplane. Simultaneously, in 1916, a guy named Gar Wood, Gar Wood, had purchased a motorboat for racing and christened it Miss Detroit. This is over in the Chicago area on the Great Lakes, and he starts a company that creates essentially, luxury craft, but affordable luxury craft that could be purchased just for the medium income, like the working Joe could get in on one of these, and uses the same technology and ideas that Johnny Schnarr was operating with. Now, in the vessel here pictured, that is also another V12 surplus airplane engine. And this is one of the great things that I really want to stress. It was immediate access to the most essential materials that made all of this possible. Anytime that you see the development of hydroplanes and incredibly fast boats, they're always going to be next to a timber industry. They were looking for a lot of light woods. In some cases, plywoods were being used for this technology, as well as any place where surplus airplane engines were being deposited. And that remains a consistent from World War I, pretty much up to today, where you're seeing this technology develop. Gar Wood is the guy who, unlike Johnny Schnarr, popularizes the sport of racing in these boats. So this is Gar Wood and his mechanic, Orland Johnson, driving together, and they popularized hydroboat racing in the Chicago area. And the Golden Cup becomes sort of the benchmark of ultra fast boat racing, and they're reaching incredible speeds with these crafts. Simultaneously, from about 1914 up through the 20s and 30s, Canadian Albert Hickman, pictured here, is pioneering his version of a jet boat. While he's not using engines as large as Gar Wood and Johnny Schnarr, he figures out pretty quickly that if he has a at least high-powered engine, that he can reach maximum speed, reducing the amount of the vessel that's in the water. So this is where Hickman develops the sea sled. And the sea sled is one of the first times that you start seeing the inverted V hull. And before World War I, this wasn't really a thing. Boats followed the traditional boat shape. But then you start seeing, let's see if I can do it here, more and more vessels like this. And this is one of the things that Hickman really comes across, is that by leaving a space, a cavity in the middle, you'll see that as that boat lifts off, it can maintain some points of contact with the water, but creating that air cavity underneath allows it to hydroplane more efficiently, increasing your speed. And Hickman really sells people on the sea sled design by putting out a bunch of magazine articles like this, which really demonstrate he's just does pros and cons. This is basically those infomercials that you see at night where it's like, are you tired of breaking your rudder on the rocks? And it's all black and white. Well, we have the solution for you. And this is what it is. With a deep draft on a motorboat, you run the risk of, when you come into shallow water, which a lot of these pleasure boat guys would have been doing, hitting something. But this ultra shallow draft that can be achieved by putting your crankshaft and your propeller right here at the level of the boat here, which will dip in a little bit as you increase in speed, you avoid things like fouling it with weeds, bending your propeller on rocks. All of this could now be done away with the invention of the sea sled. And so you see this triangle coming together between Hickman and Wood and Schnarr. All these guys, through first necessity and then convenience, are developing the new era of ultra fast boats powered by V12 surplus airplane engines. Now, the sport of hydroplaning and racing launches in the Chicago area, and then it comes back home to Seattle in the most triumphant way possible. The first time we see it is with a development out in Green Lake. So by 1929, George Hill, who is the president of the Green Lake Commercial Club, starts looking for permission from the park board to put seating up and create the field house out in Green Lake. And their hope is that in so doing, they can create a venue for races. And people ate it up. They were obsessed. I'm trying to think, pretty early on, they had upwards of 45,000 boat spectators out there watching the hydroplane and outboard motorboat races. And at the time, these more amateur craft were still reaching a speed of about 45 miles per hour, which is not legendary. I mean, and that's pretty much close to what Johnny Schnarr was doing. But we're talking, again, through the like 30s and 40s with this. But it launches the excitement of things like now we have Seafair and the unlimited hydros. So you can watch the really steady trajectory of hydroplane, airplane engine, boat races taking place Lake Washington, Green Lake, throughout the area there. And interestingly, just as a like weird historic footnote, there was a huge amount of controversy because when the boats were on Green Lake, it's got a lot of plant growth, marine biology in there. So there was always the chance that things were getting sucked up into these engines. But also it's loud. You take a V12 aircraft engine and then you line up 30 of these guys, it is a massively deafening experience. And so the residents of Green Lake were not as thrilled. They're kind of like the people that live on the golf course, right? Like some people are really into it. A lot of people are not, for whatever reason. And so there was an effort to move the hydroplanes out of the Green Lake area. And what ended up happening, I forget what year it was, a snow leopard cub at the Woodland Park Zoo died. And witnesses at the time said that the mother was not tending to her cubs. She was just staring out towards the direction of the sound of the hydroplanes. And so everyone used this as the rally point to eventually ban the hydroplane races from happening on Green Lake. Even though you go back through, there was expert testimony at this trial from several vets saying that, in fact, the cubs had pre-existing medical conditions that made it so that the mother would have neglected them. And they were like, there's really nothing to suggest other than just a couple witnesses standing out here that this had anything to do with the hydroplanes. But the water had already been boiled. People were angry before this, and it made the rally point that they really needed to ban hydroplanes from Green Lake. But nature found a way. So not only out in Seattle was it still a thing, but people were taking this design. So what you're looking at here, also, if you want to read the most in-depth detail stuff about hydroplane, spitfireofthesea.com. Spitfireofthesea.com is the website where I did a ton of research on hydroplanes, and I think they were the most succinct about this. But they have this fantastic illustration here I wanted to show you, showing that stepped design where people have figured out, so if you design your hull to create those cavities there, the blue part here is what remains in contact with the water. And so as you're reaching your maximum speeds there, there's limited contact between water and hull, but you're creating that cavitation of air underneath, and that increases the boat's ability to remain up. And more people were starting to catch on with this. So this is actually from an issue of Popular Mechanics in 1935. Again, you see more of this hydroplane technology cementing itself into the public consciousness in the 1930s, and they're all using these airplane engines. That's where the slow motion 4 starts to enter the scene for me. So while Detroit was the area where these hydroplane races were most famous and taking place, a lot of pioneers and inventors were trying to perfect the craft elsewhere. And while it was always, I'm pretty confident it would always been someone from Detroit who had won the Gold Cup before, it was finally someone in Seattle's chance. And what do you know? All these guys are connected, right? So you remember our guy, Gar Wood, who really pioneers the Detroit hydroplane races. He is involved with the gentleman who ends up creating Chris Craft, which we've talked about in the past. They're a very popular wooden pleasure boat that was made universally acceptable for everyone. The guys over here who, let's see if I can bring it up, end up creating the slow motion 4 are all involved with Mr. Ibsen here, who we've talked about before in the past as well. He is the guy who is given credit for making water skiing a popular, affordable, and exciting sport for all. And a huge part of it was his salesmanship antics. This is one of his demo reels that he did where he was out water skiing, showing how hilarious and fun he is. But BluebirdElectric.net has the best write-up I've found about the slow motion hydroplane from conception to development. But it was created out here in Seattle by this guy Ibsen, who was working already on the technology that you needed to create fiberglass or strip wood water skis. A lot of the guys who are involved in this program were also working with Boeing. And so again, you see this collaboration of water sport enthusiasts, people who had ready access to timber, and airplane engines. And so these engineers are getting together and trying to create something that can finally be a definitive winner in this quest for speed. So the slow motion boat shed dock was run by this collective of guys, but Stan Sayers and Anker Jensen are in the picture here. This is in 1950. And they designed it with this guy, Teddo Jones, who was credited with finding the way to prevent the hull from rising completely out of the water. And up to this point, that was the most challenging part. You could create an incredibly fast hydroplane that would lift out of the water, but the number one issue these guys were having as far as danger was that process continues until the bow completely flips, you cartwheel backwards, usually death and calamity would follow. So how do you create something that can lift out of the water enough to achieve hydroplaning, but not continue that cycle so aggressively that you flip over like a pancake and die? Enter the slow motion. So this was commenced at Jensen Motorboat Company in the fall of 1948. This was this basic design that they had come up with, Anchor Jensen, and not like a boat builder. This was not something that he had studied for. He had the skill set to make this happen, though, and was connected enough to, again, airplane people and boat companies and raw materials so that he could make this happen. And I believe his contact was this guy named Mike Welsh, who worked with Jones at the Boeing company and actually ends up becoming the crew chief for slow motion 4 here. And yes, were there 3 other slow motions before this? Yes, there very much was. It took some play testing to make this happen, but it ends up becoming the boat that wins the Gold Cup in Detroit, bringing it now back to Seattle. And I've got this illustration here, which I hope is helpful for you. So you've got this shallow V bottom, and then you've got a fourth. What it does is it provides this fourth point here, and then air vents let the air go aft of the bow plane. And what you're doing is you're allowing it to maintain, if I'm getting this correctly, multiple points of contact with the water, but then creating just enough drag so that it doesn't flip itself completely. And when slow motion, which is hilarious, ends up competing in the Detroit race, it dominates. They set the new record. And if I'm remembering correctly, I believe they reached, it was over 80 miles an hour. And it changed the way that hydroplane racing was done. And so now you see a lot more of it become sort of a well-endorsed sport in Washington. And it's very strange to me. I grew up in Eastern Washington originally, Spokane, then down to the Tri-Cities, and we always had the boat races, the water follies down in the Tri-Cities, which was like the big sport down there. And I didn't realize until I came, ironically, over to the part of the state where there's more water, that wasn't just a thing that everybody was into annually. We didn't all just do boat races in Washington. Apparently, that was unique. But it started, as these things always do, first in Pasco, because there was a high concentration of aviators. And what do you know? Suddenly a surplus of airplane engines. So the first water follies took place in Pasco, actually on the Snake River. And it was around the same time that the Tri-Cities hit a boom as the construction of the nuclear development facility Hanford took place. Within 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Tri-Cities became a magnet for military activity. The Pasco Airport that is there today is there because that is where the Naval Flight Training Center, and I think they've constructed like 70 buildings, suddenly filled a barren plain that was out there. You see that population jump almost, I think 7,000 servicemen are suddenly in that area, families and all. There's the naval pilots that are down there, as well as, of course, they're creating the secret facility out there where they're creating weapons grade plutonium out at Hanford. It was a huge development. And suddenly there were resources to do things like this. So at the conclusion of World War II, this is the airplane engine. This is no longer the Victory V12. This is the Allison V1710, which was the same aircraft engine that they would have had in like a P-51 Mustang, for example. But this engine became the new thing to drop in the back of an ultralight shallow draft vessel. Using that same technology from airfields, they could now create really fast boats. So I'm trying to remember the exact year. It used to be called the Atomic Cup. First, it was in Pasco, the Water Follies. Then it was the Atomic Cup, probably by, I think 1966 was the first official Pasco Kennewick Atomic Cup, always held in summer. It had 12 boats at the time when they were competing. But now today, the hydroplanes they use for this are so much more advanced than what they had at the time. But again, a lot of that technology developed there. So the irony of this whole thing is that it has always been military adjacent, right? Like these surplus aircraft engines show up and give people the technology to create hydroplanes. But it's been pioneered by criminals and professional racers. Either this technology was designed and troubleshot by people who are looking to smuggle booze or drugs, or eventually it was pioneered by guys who just wanted to go really fast and set new records. It isn't until the late 60s, early 70s that we see the military start to express a real interest in this technology. And this is where the surface effect ships first come into the area. The very first one shows up in 1963. This is the US Navy XR-1 SES. And we're going to talk about surface effect ships for a moment here. And instead of me trying to explain it to you without any visuals, I have recruited the very best YouTube has to explain it for me. So here we go.
How does air-cushioned catamarans work? Air-cushioned catamarans are surface effect ships, or SES. Principle: air is projected between the two hulls of a catamaran. This air forms an air cushion surrounded by the hulls on each side, a soft rubber skirt at the bow, an inflatable bag at the stern. Pressure in the aft bag is 10% greater than the air cushion pressure to ensure sufficient air cushion sealing. Emerged volume reduces up to 80% when the air cushion is in use, and consequently, the hull resistance is significantly reduced. Unlike hovercrafts, water jets are utilized for propulsion, since the inlet nozzles are always covered by water, and water propulsion offers a better performance than air propulsion. The air cushion and the stern bag are acting as shock absorbers and improve the comfort when sailing at very high speed. The pressure of the air cushion is regulated while maintaining position during transfers, which confers an active motion damping behavior to the vessel and increase the safety during transfers. Advantages: higher speed to power ratio, reduced fuel oil consumption, reduced wave effect on vessel motion, increased safety, improved comfort.
Thanks, YouTube. So yeah, here's the deal. The US Navy starts expressing an interest in taking this technology of creating a hydrofoil, something that can move incredibly fast and interact the least amount possible with the water beneath it. And of course, that has huge advantages. You can carry a ton of stuff incredibly quickly, pivot very, very fast, and do so under incredibly heavy seas conditions. And I believe the first roster, they approached this company, Aerojet, who was essentially building products to help with the space race to the moon. And they had a California-based company, and the Navy approaches them and is like, hey, we would like to essentially build a ship that could, I don't know, deploy 200 to 300 soldiers and a tank and maybe a helicopter, but also shoot rockets. I would like it also to move at 100 miles an hour. And so this company was like, all right, boss. But of course, what's the secret recipe you need for this success? You need easy access to materials. You need that military connection. And it's best if there's a bunch of like military airplane equipment lying around. So what do you know? They pack up and move to Tacoma. So while Aerojet General began their mission creating space production, they end up moving to Tacoma, where they're going to create the surface effect ship 100A. And to do that, they actually go to the Perkins building. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this one. It's directly across the street from Liftbridge Coffee. Aerojet brings in, I think they had 400 workers. 260 of them occupied the 6 uppermost floors of the Perkin building in downtown Tacoma. And just like we showed you, they set to work creating a vessel that has this durable rubber skirt at the front of it, and then an inflatable air bladder at the back to capture air underneath, and then allow that vessel as a catamaran to rise up and just glide across the surface. And they did it. The XR1, I think, had a pretty good rapport, but the SES 100A was incredibly remarkable. And what they wanted to do with it was create a smaller version and then demonstrate its capabilities before scaling it up. And I'm trying to, I'll remember the exact specifications here in a second, but they'd gone over different things, whether they were going to make like 1/10 size or bigger, and didn't go from there, just to prove that the technology could work. And then you could create something capable of doing whatever you want. What I think is so interesting about this design is that it really seems to me like it followed the predecessors in this area in creating that space there. And specifically that double hold catamaran style is something that you started to see develop from Johnny Schnarr creating the flat base, where he was like, this isn't working, to Hicks, who had created those different steps in there. Now you see it here. And the secondary genius of this design is that you've got two different essentially powered systems. One is forcing air into that air cavity there. So they've got a jet engine essentially blowing air inside of it. And then they have a water jet that they're using for propulsion. And this allowed it to reach speeds that they were not even comfortable admitting. The official report that went out in all of the newspapers when they were testing this is that the SES 100A could go over 80 miles an hour. The official speed was classified, but I believe it was just over 100 miles per hour that it could achieve when it was at full throttle. Now, granted, it had some weaknesses. It took a second for it to get up out of the water. As someone in his late 30s, I can definitely relate. But once it reached its like full hydrofoil speed, it was nimble, it was fast, and it was strong. It was capable of carrying an incredible amount of weight, especially considering what it was. And now bear in mind, like the fastest naval vessels with a similar carrying capacity you were looking at probably like 35 to 40 knots. This is more than double that speed. And they proved that it could be done in the 1970s. And so right down here in Commencement Bay, they set to work creating this ship and then launched it. And it had several test operations here in Hood Canal, all up and down Puget Sound. I've read a few accounts that some pretty notable members of the community were on board. They had senators, they had diplomats come out and experience this so that they could show, hey, we are ready to roll with this craft. And it was all happening here in Tacoma. Now, they had a simultaneous program happening where they were creating the SES 100B, which I'm trying to think, both of them were 100 tons. They were both 80 feet long, 40 foot a beam. And the SES 100B could also reach its maximum speed. Oh gosh, I think it was 90 to 100 miles per hour. I think the official one that they stated was 92 miles per hour. And the 100B was being built by Bell Aerospace down in Texas. And it was a very similar design. They were just trying to prove that this could be done. But the distinction that the B had is that they fired one of these rockets that they were talking about off the stern of it. And that was one of the things that they wanted to ensure that any of these craft was capable of, was having rocket technology available to it, as well as having a complement on there, something heavy enough armament that it would be an effective and fast ship that they could deploy into these combat zones in the 1960s and 70s. And the thing that really made them appealing at the time, or at least what everyone was writing about in the paper, is that they could operate almost completely out of the water on its air cushion. So I think their draft was 18 inches, which, when you think about a 100-ton, 80-foot vessel capable of carrying, in some cases, a tank, certainly a rocket system, being only requiring 18 inches of water to operate at close to 100 miles per hour and still be able to do that even in heavy seas conditions, this was revolutionary. People were losing it at the time. But you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Chris, so if these ships are so great, why aren't they everywhere? Well, from this futuristic space design that they came up with here to the technology that it was pioneering, you would have thought that would be the case. But you really see the surface effect ships almost vanish entirely from the US Navy's arsenal and the discussion altogether by the early 1980s. And the SES-100A was the only one that was produced here in Tacoma. And while it passed all of its tests and everyone was super excited about it, it didn't go anywhere. And so there was some discussion as to what could possibly be going on with this. And so I was talking to a few people about, what was the issue going on with these hydrofoils. And one of the guys I had I think the most interesting account from thus far was saying he was a diver who was responsible for working with this craft, and that sometimes, they would go just bombing through Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Hood Canal, wherever, and they could just demolish, like go over logs and stuff, no issue. One of the biggest things he had to do was take wood splinters out of the rubber skirt at the front. But for the most part, it was indestructible. It rode smooth on the water. Everybody was impressed by it. But around that time, when you think about, what's the most important thing out here? It was aerial combat. I haven't verified this. I haven't seen a definitive source say this, but I would say most of the programs that were looking at investing in surface effect ships abandoned the program because there was a change in leadership. A lot of the people that were pioneering these programs retired or left, and there wasn't the same interest in developing them. It didn't appear like it was going to be as cost effective, and it was more beneficial in the long run to create massive aircraft carriers that could deploy an entire, squadron of ultra fast jets that were capable of doing significantly more damage and destroying the sound barrier. The surface effect ships just didn't look like they were going to have the same combat readiness. Plus, they don't have, they're at their best when they're in a state of hydrofoil. So let me see if I can get the good one here. When it is up and out of the water, it's incredibly strong. It is almost unparalleled fast. Certainly in respect to any sort of naval vessel, nothing goes fast enough to catch it or anything. But if you're doing a long journey over the sea, this doesn't have the same appeal to it. And one of the naval solutions to that was creating the Pegasus class hydrofoils, which combined the best of both worlds. This has a more traditional hull, but you can see down here, it has the hydrofoils built in. So as this reaches its maximum speed, it lifts out of the water and skates along on those hydrofoils. This allows it to maintain a more traditional hull for long ocean voyages, but when it needs to get up to speed, it can. And the Pegasus class ones only get up to about 50 knots, which is still way less than the SES-100A, but they were trying to workshop some solutions here. Interestingly enough, all 6 of the Pegasus class ships that were ever produced, only 6 were ever made, were all done up in Seattle by, what do you know, the Boeing company, using Oh my goodness, twin turbocharged Mercedes-Benz diesel engines and waterborne jets. It's as if they just keep using the exact same punchline for this over and over again. Now, that's not to say that the surface effect ships aren't being used at all. This is the Skjold class corvette. This is in use today by the Norwegian Navy, and it's the exact same concept as the SES 100A. It has a flexible rubber skirt at the front and then that inflatable air packet at the back there. And what they discovered is that for maneuvering in fjords and tight areas and not doing long ocean voyages, this is an incredible and effective craft. It allows you to not have to worry about running into rocks or anything as much, and to move at speeds that are really unparalleled. Which was the other thing that the US Navy had talked to the Tacoma area shipbuilders about doing, is maybe creating some of these to be used for combating piracy. But the timing was wrong. The time when these were being produced here in Tacoma, the focus was really on Cold War combat of Russian vessels, and not policing small drug boats going up and down the coast. And so we see the surface effect ship 100A vanish almost completely, just as a blip in time here in Tacoma. But what I thought was so fascinating about it, the more I dug into it, is how rich the legacy of hydroplane technology and these ultra-fast boats using airplane engine technology was in the area. So there you go. And yeah, I mean, when you look around, the boat legacy in Washington is astounding. And I feel like it's just something that most people don't really think of when they think about Washington State, which is fascinating to me. But our naval connection, both as a coastal state, but also, our connection to everything that happens in Puget Sound and the Columbia River, is really expansive. And I think a lot of naval technology has really come to fruition here in the state. So if you guys have questions about this, please let me know. But if not, I'm wishing you all a phenomenal holiday season. I hope everything goes incredibly well and that you get to savor this time. And know that we're coming back next year with even more incredible content and more virtual tours. So please drop us your suggestions. If there's anything you're super excited or interested in, just let me know. We'll do what we can. But as always, fantastic to see you guys. And I hope that we get to chat more soon. Until then, enjoy the holiday. Keep on exploring.